Hello again. So we're back. We now have done some pretty considerable amount of context. So I think it really is time to get started on doing some more context. Last week we got to see the emergence, evolution of the other two inheritors of Rome, the Byzantine world and the Islamic world. And the readings, my historical introduction, the textbook all make the point, I think, effectively that these three societies have a lot in common and that they're interconnected. And even as they rise and fall a little bit at the expense of one another, you have, especially with the emergence of the Abbasid Caliphate, pretty positive relations as they emerge. So, how do we get from there to this, you know, outburst of unprecedented violence along religious lines that is the First Crusade? It's a tricky question, and to get there, I think we need to ruminate for a minute on just how fundamentally weird the First Crusade was. At least this will help us understand why it's necessary to have this additional unit of context to bridge that gap. So, let me lay out the chronology. I think that'll be most effective. One, in 1071, Seljuk Turks, a new ethnic group, Central Asian steppe group who had recently converted to Islam and arrived on the scene, and the Abbasid Caliphate took advantage of the fragmentation of it to establish some kind of dominance in much of the Middle East. This new group arrived on the scene and in 1071 came into direct conflict with the Byzantine Empire, which, as you recall, up to this point still controlled most of Asia Minor. But at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Byzantine emperor is killed, the Byzantines suffer a terrible defeat, and basically the whole or most of Asia Minor falls to the Seljuks, who quickly fragment. This is a massive blow to the Byzantine Empire. Takes almost a half of everything they have left, really, territorially, and that's going to have a big impact. So on the face of it, it might make some sense, right? Okay, a crusade in retaliation for Manzikert, but there's a little bit of a challenge in the chronological gap that follows. See, 24 years pass without any particular response from the Byzantine world, any sustained attempt to recapture Asia Minor, or any major request to the Latin West. Now, notably, and in your readings, you'll see Pope Gregory VII in the Latin West briefly played with the idea of calling for aid to Asia Minor to help with this purely secular loss of his Christian brethren and all of that. That makes sense because partially he's maybe hoping to heal the Great Schism, but it goes nowhere because of other bigger fish to fry that we'll see in the form of the investiture controversy. So 24 years pass, and a new Byzantine emperor, Alexios Komnenos, who's had some initial success against Normans, actually, operating in his realm, area of the world, the bigger threat being the Normans who are going to come now help on the crusade, as it were, writes to Urban II in 1095 and requests aid. Now, the point I want to make very clear here is that his request is limited, right? This is item number 2, 1095. He requests aid, probably imagining a few hundred knights. Hey, you've got those heavily armored, shiny-looking knights. They're new on the scene. They're cool. Come send some of them to help us reclaim Asia Minor. Purely secular goal, no mention of Jerusalem whatsoever, of course, because Jerusalem had been under Islamic control since 639. That's not something that was lost at Manzikert. So, help us retake Asia Minor and go home, and that's the whole message. Urban II, Pope at the time, responds with surprising speed to this request. He goes to France, this is item number 3, and hosts the Council of Clermont in France, where he gives a rousing speech of some kind. You're going to read multiple variants of that speech because they don't fully agree with each other, but it's got echoes of what Gregory VII had done earlier, 20 years before, but now he's saying Jerusalem. Go to Jerusalem, retake Jerusalem. Okay, that's a little weird. Alexios hadn't asked for Jerusalem. It wasn't really on anyone's table because it had been under Islamic control for over 4 centuries now. So where'd that come from? So item 1, 1071, Seljuk Turks massacred Byzantine Empire halved. Okay, 24 years later, item 2, request for help by Emperor Alexius Komnenos to Pope Urban II. Item 3, Urban II organizes a movement to retake Jerusalem, which is not in any way what Alexius asked for. Now it's going to get even weirder. Item 4 here is that up to 50,000 peasants go on a rampage in Germany, killing all the Jews they can find. What? It's not what Urban asked. Has nothing to do with Jerusalem. Doesn't really seem to have anything to do with Muslims. What? And then item 5, the crusade Urban actually requested, gets started. So that's weird. That is a fundamentally difficult to explain sequence of events. To understand first why Urban responded the way he did, we really need to take a closer look at what's going on in Europe in the 11th century leading up to the First Crusade that happens at the end of the 11th century. And that'll also help us understand how people responded. This chain of events that's weird would have been fundamentally inconceivable even 1 century earlier, even 100 years before, even a half century really before this. It would have been absolutely unimaginable that this could happen. Until you get to the second half of the 11th century, no pope could have dreamed of exercising the kind of power and authority that Urban does at Clermont. They would have loved it, but even Urban's authority is hotly contested in his own reign, right? He's actively in exile. He's running from the emperor who's out to get him, which you will have to check more into the context to understand why that's going on. But all right, set that aside. Suppose you had a pope who for some reason did have that kind of authority, though none before did. Well, he wouldn't have had any motivation to call a crusade, as it were. I mean, the chief incentive that Alexios dangles before Urban II is healing this divide between the Greek church and the Latin church from 1054, the Great Schism, which everybody assumed was going to get healed at some point. It wasn't the first schism between the two, after all. Nobody thought it was going to be the last, but it would be, for reasons we'll see in Crusade 4. More on that later. So, supposing a pope, for some reason, did have the motivation to do this and the ability, he wouldn't have been met with a receptive audience until just now either. Christian theology of just war hadn't really fully been articulated yet. I mean, even as recently as 1066 in the Norman invasion, war was a necessary evil at best, one for which, even if you receive papal approval, one has to do penance. So war is an actual, potentially holy, pious thing. That's new. That really wasn't there before. The popular enthusiasm, one might say even fanaticism, over this idea of penitential pilgrimage is a fairly recent development too. And the First Crusade really was a pilgrimage. That's how it was framed. That's how the Crusaders thought of themselves. And what they were after was penance, was the remission of sins. So that trend is absolutely necessary as well. Scholars frequently point to, a little controversially, but they frequently point to apocalypticism as a common sentiment, that the idea the world was going to end soon and Jerusalem had to be in Christian hands really only applies at the end of the 11th century. Due to a sort of dating thing that you'll get to read about more going forward. Aside from those religious, cultural things, you have a unique blend of demographic shifts, economic shifts, political shifts, which all create a unique combination to facilitate the First Crusade, this recipe, if you will, for a pious bloodbath, the one that we'll see in our next unit. For now, though, before we get really dark, let's just lay out the ingredients and start stirring the pot, so to speak. It's going to be getting pretty ominous. You'll see where this is going, I think, by the end. But we really do need to do this final unit of context to understand how things have changed. So read carefully, and hope you have a strong stomach for some of what's coming in the next week. Good luck.